doing this bit.
Okay.
Revive.
Welcome back to Ontario Church Stories. I'm Dan Bennett,
I'm Claire Fuller.
and we're here in Dixon Hill, Ontario, just north of Markham. Why have we chosen this location, Claire?
We chose here because this is the center of a movement among 19th century Mennonites that was a revival of their religion, a revival of their faith, and this place was where it had a focus.
We're looking at a common experience of Christians through history and around the world, revival. Sometimes the church gets distracted by good works. Sometimes the church gets caught up in organization or rules, power struggles, and scandalous behavior. God needs to do something to wake people up. And that has happened many times in church history and in many, many lands. Continual experiences of revival among churches. And we're talking about a revival here among Mennonites back in the late 19th century. These are not Mormons. Just who were the Mennonites?
The Mennonites we're talking about were people who came up from Pennsylvania at the late 18th century, early 1900s, into Ontario looking for farmland. They mainly settled in Niagara first, then they bought land in the Waterloo County, but when there was some difficulty with the title in the Waterloo County, many of them shifted to York County. And so we have these three main settlement areas of Mennonites in Ontario: Niagara, Waterloo, and York.
So they came from the U.S., and originally they came from Europe and settled in the U.S. Looking for religious freedom. They came out of Switzerland very shortly after the Reformation in the 16th century. They were distinctive in that they believed in adult baptism as opposed to infant baptism. They had a strong emphasis on the community as a community of believers and separate from the world. And so they did not participate in government and particularly military operations. They're known as a peace church. In Waterloo County, when we think of Mennonites, we often think of the old order Mennonites who drive horses and buggies and maintain a 19th century lifestyle, farms without electricity. But they're a small minority of Mennonites. We have many modern Mennonite churches who maintain the Mennonite traditions of community and pacifism and participate fully in Canadian life.
In the 19th century, they looked a lot like their neighbors. They dressed very similarly. There was no community dress code. When they got into York County, they weren't able to settle in a compact colony like they did in Waterloo. In York and also Niagara, they had to buy land, farmland scattered among their English-speaking neighbors. So it wasn't so easy for them to maintain the community.
What's that book you have there, Claire?
Dan, this is In Search of Promised Lands, a book published this year, authored by Samuel J. Steiner. He was the archivist for 25 years at the Mennonite Archives of Ontario, kept at Conrad Grable College. And we're going to be talking to him about Mennonites in York County.
They were challenged by just the changes in the culture as their farming became more specialized, as they started to add dairy and beef herds to their grain farming. They started to participate in agricultural associations and societies, and which more conservative leaders would have had some problems with, of being unequally
like fall fairs, or
well, not so much fall fairs, but even getting together with other people in your community about best agricultural practices. But these weren't necessarily Mennonites, and they probably weren't pacifists, and so forth. And when you became too easy, too comfortable with people that weren't Mennonites, that meant you were more susceptible to the religious views that they might be expressing.
it was the Methodists mainly that that pushed some Mennonites to want something new in their spiritual life. The Methodists were a movement started in England by John Wesley and his brother Charles Wesley and George Whitefield. They wanted to renew the Anglican Church and all of England, and they nearly accomplished it. They wanted people to know that they should be regenerated, born again, to have an experience with God, that they would know that God in Jesus had given them new life. People should be able to testify about it, to say, yes, God has put new life into me, and this is my experience. They were talking about it in their prayer meetings. They were talking about it to their neighbors, including their Mennonite neighbors in this region. By the time of Wesley's death in 1891, there was a society. He started about 50,000, 60,000 people scattered around England and equal numbers in the US, and the beginning of a movement in Ontario. They organized their people in prayer groups and in testifying groups and personal discipleship groups where people were expected to say what God was doing in their lives that very week and how they'd worked through it or failed or responded to God. When that kind of preaching came to York County, where there were English people and also German-speaking Mennonites rather, those German-speaking Mennonites, oh man, they were settled in among their Methodist neighbors. They would hear them in their church life, in their prayer meetings, and some might say, I'd like to be like that. We don't have that in our church. I like that. So they would say, come back to their family and say, I need something like these people have in their experience with God.
They naturally would have been attracted to renewal religious groups around them, most particularly in York County would have been the Methodists.
Why do you say that they would be naturally attracted?
Well, they would have gone to school with these people. Mennonites only went to church every 2 weeks or so, and oftentimes, at least I saw this in Waterloo County, on the other week, particularly the younger people might well go to a Methodist Sunday school or go to a Methodist church, so they would have been exposed to the style of worship and the kind of message that these groups presented.
Intermarriage was happening, and so the German-speaking Mennonites were noticing that some of their members were going out, but they didn't all take that route.
Some of the men that we're talking about today stayed with the Mennonites and began to teach these,
They thought
and
of
to
themselves-
practice these experiences.
Yes, they were Mennonite ordained preachers, the foundation of it. A guy called Abraham Raymer, another one called Christian Troyer from Vaughan, and these guys thought of themselves as Mennonites and didn't see that had to change. What was the spiritual attraction of Methodism to Mennonite people?
Yeah, I think, well, I would have said, and I would have emphasized this in my book, that a search for assurance of salvation.
Okay.
Knowing that you were saved, knowing that you were going to heaven when you died, having that confidence was not something that was part of Mennonite spiritual life prior to that. That it would have been, you trusted in God's grace, you hoped for your salvation, you tried to live a disciplined Christian life, but it was a little proud to speak with too much confidence.
I've seen that in comments too. That
Yeah.
Somebody said, according to so-and-so, he was on good terms with God. That's just his way of saying his thought.
And when you get to the Old Order Mennonite division in the 1880s, one of the criticisms always was of the more liberal Mennonites was that they were proud.
We're here at Byers Cemetery in Markham, just north of the town of Markham. In this family plot are buried some of the Byers family and neighbors. Here is the gravestone of Elizabeth Byers Raymer, the wife of Abraham Raymer. We suppose that this is Abraham Raymer's tombstone here, plain field stone set up as a marker. Abraham Raymer was born in 1814 in Markham Township. He was made a preacher of the Mennonite Church somewhere in the 1830s, and after preaching for a while he started to think
I'm not even sure I'm a Christian. I haven't got any assurance that Jesus has forgiven my sins. And he sought for the same kind of experience that his Methodist neighbors had, an assurance of conversion, an assurance that he was a child of God. And that kind of preaching, when he started preaching that regeneration message, was not acceptable to the Mennonite preaching houses, and he had to leave them. And he went into houses, barns, taverns, churches that opened it up, school buildings, anywhere he could get a hearing to talk about the need to be born again. He led prayer groups in homes, and some of those led to the conversion, like the tavern owner at Box Grove, Mr. Mapes. He had the Stone Jug Tavern, and after that revival, Mr. Mapes got converted. He closed down his tavern and turned it into just an ordinary home. People like John Steckley at Bethesda area was converted and became a minister in the New Mennonites. Abraham Raymer was a man who sparked a revival. He, with others like John Steckley and Christian Troyer, and they chose the name, an organization name, the New Mennonite Society, here in York County.
So Claire, we found some Troyer tombstones here. Where are we?
We're in Vaughan Township, former Vaughan Township, city of Vaughan now. We're at the former Edgeley Mennonite Meeting House property. The building here was built in 1824, but it's been moved to Black Creek Pioneer Village in Toronto now. Right beside us here are gravestones of some Troyer relatives. Here's the wife of Christian Troyer. We haven't seen Christian Troyer's own marker, but there's his wife Magdalena.
Tell me about Christian Troyer.
He was born in 1797 in Long Point, Ontario. Probably the family moved to Vaughan Township in 1804 to farm. His father bought and sold land around Vaughan Township, and Christian Troyer got his own land there. He married a wife in 1822, a lady called Magdalena Kober, and they raised a family of 10 children.
So how does revival come into this story?
Okay, well, about 1830, his name was drawn by lot to become the preacher of the Schmidt Meeting House, which is Edgeley Meeting House here in Vaughan Township.
You mean drawn out of a hat?
Well, yeah, something like that. His name on a piece of paper was pulled out of a Bible or a hymn book by some senior person in the church, and then it would say, Christian Troyer, you're going to be our preacher from now on.
That is in the Bible in the first chapter of Acts.
Okay, yeah. During the next couple of decades, he was hearing all about these revivals. Charles Finney was doing huge revivals just across the lake in New York, over and over in the 1830s. The Methodists were busy in all over the northern part of Lake Ontario, all along the shoreline there, and in Markham. They're busy everywhere, and a guy like Christian Troyer could not have avoided hearing about the need for heart change, the need for confidence that God had called you and assured you of salvation, and the call to be a holy person. He couldn't have avoided that. And Christian Troyer, probably like Abraham Raymer, started wanting to preach that way too. We don't know his story very well. But we do know that in 1850, his bishop in Markham, a guy called Grove, was writing to his fellow bishop in Waterloo, called Benjamin Eby, and saying that about their troubles with a guy called Daniel Hawk in Vineland, who was preaching things that they didn't want. And he also mentioned, and Christian Troyer is gone out. That means he's left the group. He wasn't behaving the way he was supposed to in the Mennonite church.
So Christian Troyer was illiterate. I understand he signed his final will and testament with an X.
Yes, so I hear.
Do we have any other information about his life?
Not much. He showed up at a couple of Mennonite church conferences, that is the group that came out of the old Mennonites, and one of them, the secretary of the meeting, said that Christian Troyer gave a very long account of God's work within his life, and I would love to have had that recorded. I'd love to have been there, and I'd be busy making notes, because that's the closest we ever came to hearing a coherent story of the man's life. It's gone as far as I know. Only God knows it now.
It's as silent as these stones.
Yeah, we don't even have his own stone. Here's a C. Troyer, a child of 3 years old. There's some children of another Troyer relative. So that's all that earth remains have now. It's only if it weren't for God knowing the stories of these people, I'd rather despair that anything you do for God is going to remain. But with God, it's there in eternity.
So when did he die, Claire?
He died in 1883, and his friend John Steckley wrote a beautiful obituary for him in Gospel Banner, and I think the Mennonites also put a obituary for him in their Gospel Herald.
So no gravestone, but
No.
some short facts that we've managed to pull together for this story.
I wish we knew more. But from this sprang up a cluster of churches, 7 or 8 churches, 100 members. In the mid-20th century, there were 600 or 800 members in 5 or 6 regional churches, all springing from these men's work. Most of them Mennonite in origin, but some of them with English names, because they reached into the community and drew people like Timbers and Elliott and Pike and names like that who were German in background.
And this was the root of the missionary church, which later became the Evangelical Missionary Church of Canada.
Right. One of the great founding clusters of believers in the mid-19th century.